Hello and welcome to this webinar. Welcome to everyone joining us today. Today we are going to talk about the transitional sound when new hearing aids reshape the self. And we'll take about 40 minutes planned, hopefully not longer. But in these 40 minutes, we will introduce the concept of transitional sound. We will try to explain how it emerged from our empirical material, and we will try to characterize the idea of transitional sound by using empirical examples. And finally, in the third part, we'll talk about what we see as the implications of using transitional sound. Why is it important to have this concept, and what does the concept of transitional sound enable us to see? We were very interested in what can it show us of everyday life with a hearing loss and using hearing aids. So my name is Niels Henrik Hansen. I'm from CFD, and together with my colleague Natasha Sophie Søndergaard, we will talk about our development of transitional sound and the implications of it. We are both researchers at CFD in Denmark. CFD is an organization which offers counseling services for deaf-blind, and hard of hearing people. We are an old organization, and we have a tradition to take into considerations how it is to live with hearing loss, deafness, and deaf blindness. So this work we will present today is in that tradition. I just want to mention also that we have developed the idea of transitional sound together with our colleague Eva Juhl Troldam. She was not able to be part of this webinar, but she was the one who minted the idea. So thank you, Eva, for this idea. So welcome, and thank you to NVC for giving us the possibility to present our work. We hope you will find this as interesting as we do, and we hope that when we are done today, you will be leaving with an idea of what transitional sound is, why it can be important, and what it can show about how it is to live in the modern society with advanced hearing aids. So on to next slide. And this slide we will tell a bit about how this project began, because it began with another project. It was a project about inequality in hearing rehabilitation, and we were doing this project together with the University of Copenhagen, and we were interviewing a large group of hard of hearing people about how it was to live with hearing aids and hearing disability in Denmark, and how they were using hearing rehabilitation services. We were very interested in the last thing about using hearing rehabilitation services, and was especially interested in equality to access to hearing rehabilitation. But as it turned out, when we began to analyze this very, very large amount of interviews with people living with hearing loss in Denmark, we discovered something that was not expected, something that was not part of the inequality to hearing rehabilitation, but something was common for many of the people we were interviewing. Especially, a lot of the history would have this focal points in transition when they were all experienced hearing aid users, and when they got a new hearing aid, we had this period of time which was felt very intensely, very profoundly, and it was somewhat unexpected that it was so important in their stories. It was like you had this focal points which was turning points in their life with hearing loss. So it was unexpected, and this was how we began to analyze it in terms of transitional sound. For those of you who are interested, we have published 2 articles from this project, it's a different interest in this project. So it's not about transitional sounds, it's about inequality in hearing rehabilitation. But I have written on the slide 2 articles for those of you who are interested. But out of this became the interest in transitional sound. And it was when we found this concept of transitional sound, it was like something was missing, because it's not that we are not talking about the difficulties when you're getting a hearing aid. Especially if you are a new user of hearing aids, it's very well known that you have to adapt to life with a hearing aid. But in this project, or in this concept, we are talking about experienced users. They have already been using hearing aids, for many of them in many years, and have always been living with the hearing aids and hearing tools and all kinds of stuff they're using to hear well. But it was still, we were missing something, and this something was the birth of transitional sound. And let me give an example. Try to imagine that you are a well experienced hearing aid user. You get a new set of hearing aids. You have always been using hearing aids, and you have waited long for this, and you are really looking forward. New hearing aids, new possibilities, new technology. It might enable you to do something you were not able to do earlier, or it might be a big help in your everyday life. The technology is very advanced, and you are being told that your hearing has improved. But, however, it's not what you are feeling. You are feeling kind of confusing, because the sounds are not precisely as they were before. Some things are different. There is some sounds that might be missing, but there's also new sounds, and it's kind of difficult because it was not what you were expecting. And you also are experiencing at a time of your life when you are more exhausted and more tired. But why? The new hearing aids should be better. And this is at the core transitional sound. And this is what we will be exploring in the next part, where my colleague Natasha will tell you about what's in transitional sound.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I am Nils Henrik's colleague, and I'll be talking a little bit more about what we mean by transitional sound. Just to introduce myself, I am an anthropologist and a PhD student at CFD, and I'm currently working with how people with hearing loss go through rehabilitation in the Danish public healthcare system. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by transitional sound, and just to begin with, we understand it as both a period of time and an experience. So we're looking at it as something that happens from when you get a new set of hearing aids and you're going through a period of time where you have to get used to the sound, but also an experience of this period of time where you might experience that it's very aggressive or volatile, or you might just generally feel like you're kind of standing on uncertain ground in this period of time. So we're taking kind of a psychosocial approach to understanding this transitional period between hearing aids. So we're not looking at it as sort of a technical thing you have to go through, or even just a very simplified understanding of you just have to get used to it. But we're looking at it through this kind of psychosocial lens, where we're understanding that people with hearing loss have a personal experience, and also it has a social impact when you're going through a transitional period like this. We also see it as an uncertain period of time where individuals with hearing loss have to adjust to the experience of new hearing aids. So we're considering it to be both a period of time and an experience. Secondly, we see it as being characterized by a lack of connection, comprehension, and certainty. And by that, we mean a lack of connection, both because you might sense that you are disconnected from the world around you, because you might feel that sounds are off, everything feels different, something is just a little bit weird, so you might not recognize the sounds around you. And at the same time, you might feel like there's a lack of comprehension, both on your own part. You might experience that it's hard kind of comprehending what sounds are around you, what you should understand them as, but it's also comprehension in the sense that people around you might have a very hard time understanding why this is such a difficult period of time. And finally, it's also characterized by a lack of certainty, and this is probably one of the more important parts of this transitional sound period, which is that when you're going through a period of time where it feels like every sound that you've been so used to knowing and understanding from when you had your hearing aids before, and then now they kind of feel a little different. It feels like it's sounds you know, but they're just a little bit off. You might get that sense of being uncertain, and what our the people we've interviewed kind of call standing on uncertain ground. So this feeling of not really knowing what's happening around you and feeling very uncertain and insecure about that. And finally, we understand it as an aspect of hearing labor. And hearing labor is a term we've coined here in CFD that's supposed to kind of encapsulate all the labor, all the effort that goes around having a hearing loss and having hearing aids. So it's supposed to kind of help understand all the types of work that you have to do when you have a hearing loss and you have hearing aids and you're trying to make everything function. So it could both be like emotional work, but it could also be social communicative work. It can be comprehensive work, so learning how to understand sounds, like here in transitional sound. But it could also be labor around like bureaucracy and healthcare systems. You might experience that you have to do a lot of work to engage with these systems and to feel like you're getting the help you need. So that is what we understand by hearing labor. And we also have a little model, which is, it's two circles. It's a larger circle and a smaller circle inside it. And in the larger circle, it says hearing labor, and in the smaller circle, it says transitional sound. And it's just to show that we understand transitional sound to be one aspect of hearing labor. It's one thing amongst many that people with hearing loss usually have to work with to make their everyday lives function. And by calling it hearing labor, we also want to highlight that right now, a lot of people experience they have to do this hearing labor on their own, but it is possible to delegate work. It is possible for other people to be taking on some of this work instead of just assuming or expecting that the individual with hearing loss will do all of it on their own. Okay, and then I just want to clarify what transitional sound is not. And on the slide it says not the same as auditory acclimation, not necessarily predictable, and not just relevant for new users of hearing aids. To begin with, it's important to note that it is not the same as auditory acclimation, which is a term that audiologists or clinicians would usually use to kind of explain, the period of time it takes to get used to a set of hearing aids. They might say, oh, it's going to be 6 to 8 weeks. You should wear your new hearing aids about 8 hours a day from morning to evening. And while we're also looking at the same period of time that they're looking at, we're looking at it from a different angle. So we're not looking at it as something that's sort of easily documented, but we're looking at it as something that is experiential, something that really affects people in their everyday lives and has a real impact on their social lives and their internal lives. It's also not necessarily predictable, which is also relevant in terms of this understanding of auditory acclimation that audiologists might use, because we look at it as something that might take 6 to 8 weeks. It might take a lot longer. It might be experienced in the way we describe it here. It might be a little different as well. And not everyone experiences it. So it's not easy to predict exactly how it's going to look for the individual. And finally, it's not just relevant for new hearing aid users. Most people talk about auditory acclimation when you get your first pair of hearing aids, so when you're an inexperienced user. But we think that transitional sound is also really important and relevant for people who are going from one set of hearing aids to another. So looking at people who are already experienced hearing aid users and acknowledging the work that they put into still understanding the sound that they get now. And I think that's all from me. And now I'll let my colleague Nelson take over and talk about the theoretical outset we have for understanding this.
Thank you, Natasha. That was very, very interesting and very nice to hear. I learned something each time you tell me about transitional sound. And now we will try to look at transitional sound from another perspective, namely a theoretical perspective. And now I will present our framework, because we need truly a framework to understand why this transitional sound is so challenging, even for people who are used to use hearing aids and have been living with hearing impairment for all their life. So we need different theoretical approaches to understand why this is so profound experience. And we have chosen to use three different sources or three parts to this framework, which I'm going to present now. And the three parts are: one, science and technology studies, in other words, Bruno Latour's approach; and secondly, Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, which is used to understand the body-mind relation; and finally, we have Victor Turner's, which is an anthropologist, understanding of rituals, especially his use of liminality in understanding different processes and transitions in life. So to make it easy, you could say I have made a slide to present what is the core of their argument. And the science technology studies has as a core that technology is not just something you use and it's a part of life. So it's not just neutral. The technology is an actor like a person, and it changes. It has an impact on your life, and you, at the other hand, impact it too. But it's not neutral. So in short, technology is never just technology. It does something to you and your life. This is the main part from that. If you look at the Merleau-Ponty's approach, that is simply saying that you are a body, and as a body, you sense your surroundings. You're not just a brain which is cut off for everything else. You have a body and you sense with it. It also says that your senses are not disconnected from your brain. You don't have a brain which works independently of your senses. It's all connected. So if you change something in one of your senses, it changes your perception of life. So it's connecting your mind, your body, and surroundings to clarify that if you change any of these things, you change all of the things at once. And finally, Turner's concept of liminality is to open why is this such a difficult process when it's a short one. And he says that if you have a transition time, a time with liminality, it's also a time for development of possibilities, both negative and positive. So I will, in the following slides, take each one more in depth to illustrate these points. So we have science and technology studies. It says technology is not neutral. I have tried to make a drawing showing that if you're using hearing aids, it does something to you. The technology is not just amplifying the sounds you need to hear, but it's also, it can be a sign of stigma. If you're using hearing aids, you are a hearing impaired person. So then the hearing aid is symbolizing something about you as a person, which is sometimes not good. But you could also say that the technology in the hearing aids does something to you, to your life, because today hearing aids are very advanced. So they have several microphones, several programs. So they do they take some decisions for you, which sounds are being amplified, which sounds are not being amplified. And in that sense, you could say this technology is a partner to your hearing life, which is helping you hearing better, but it's also an integrated part of your life, sometimes very intimately connected to you. So that's science and technology studies helping us to understand that a hearing aid is not just a hearing aid, it's also a kind of technology which takes decisions on you, it connects with your life, it changes something. And then we have the Merleau-Ponty, which describe how you're connected, yourself is connected to the surrounding, to the world around you. And his idea is that perception is not just something that happens in the brain or in your mind alone. It happens through your body too. And if you change some of these factors, it changes a lot. So we are, in his word, our bodies, and our brain is part of that. And that could be very. The interesting part here is that when you change, as in here, you change something in your hearing, and even though if you know you are expected, you know you're getting a new set of hearing aids, and you are expecting that the sound is different, you hope the sound is better, you know it's better, but this explains how it can be very difficult because you have to recode your brain, and some of your senses are changing, so all of your being in the world are changing too. So that is the part that makes it sometimes very profound, that small changes in how you hear and what you hear and what you not hear are maybe big changes to experience, because it sets a question about your perception of reality around you. Finally, if we look into the last theoretical approach, Victor Turner and his idea about liminality, it's a really anthropologist view of the world. Everything is a ritual, and as such we have three parts of the ritual, and we are especially interested in the middle part of the ritual, the part where you are transforming from one situation, in this part the old structure, the old way of hearing with the old part of hearing aids, which you have integrated using in your everyday life, to the new hearing aids. When you have a time where you have to learn to live with the hearing aids, the new hearing aids, and the sounds you are getting, you have to integrate it. And this time is, as Natasha said, a time of uncertainty. You have self-doubt. You are in a time of life where you think things are not as they used to. You are, as the picture paints, walking on a thin line, and you are between the old and the new ones. You eventually one day will be well known to you, but this is uncertain. One important difference from Turner's use of liminality is that in his view on rituals, the rituals are very public. It's very open that now you are going through a ritual, and now you are maybe going from being a child to an adult. That's the classic ritual. You are in between these two positions, and it's very public. Everyone in the little village on the little island, the typical anthropologist view of the world, knows you are in this ritual. But here it's different, because not everyone knows you are in between hearing aids. It might not be very clearly seen by your surroundings. Very often it's an internal process, something you struggle with within. And we see in our data that often it's also very difficult for people with hearing impairment themselves to articulate why they think this period of time is so difficult, because they are tired, they have new sounds, and it's not very often you can articulate that, oh, I'm very pressed at the moment because I have new hearing aids and such. So that's the theoretical framework, which altogether help us to understand that technology, that the STS part shapes our perception. So if you change from one technology, which is the old hearing aids, to a new technology, new hearing aids, it changes your perception of your surroundings. And Merleau-Ponty helps us understand that changes in perception affects identity and orientation. So it has a price. You have a price to pay if you integrate the new technology.
And just to finish for Nilsenek, the final thing we wanted to point out about the theoretical framework was that Turner and his theory of liminality aids us in understanding sort of the temporariness of this period of time, but also how impactful it can be on the individual. And together, all these theoretical approaches help us to kind of understand sort of the deep human experience of this period of time and how it can affect the individual. And now I'll be talking a little bit about what we find, so some of our empirical findings from this study, and please try to keep the theoretical framework in mind as much as you can. But I'll be trying to go through a little bit what we found based on our interviews. So I'll just quickly read aloud our main findings and then I'll delve a little bit deeper into them. So first, we found that the duration of the transitional period varies really greatly in between individuals. We also found that the period is characterized by a sense of standing on uncertain ground. It can feel necessary to isolate from others during this time, and the individual's perspective on this period affects one's experience. So how you look at it or think about it affects the way you experience it. And before I delve a little bit into some of these insights, I'll also introduce two people that are going to help us guide through all these insights. They're based on our empirical material, but highly anonymized. So I'm going to present Finn and Mia. So Finn is a young man in his 30s. He works with children in his everyday life. He has a pretty severe hearing loss, but has had the experience that hearing aids work really well for him. And he loves to sing and play music in his free time. And then we have Mia, who is in her 50s. She has two teenagers that live at home, and she works an office job with a lot of meetings. In her free time, she likes to be out in nature, but she has a pretty sort of medium hearing loss, but has always found that hearing aids are a little bit difficult for her to figure out. So these are the two people we're going to keep in mind. And then I'm going to start by showing you a little painting or a little drawing we've made for this presentation that is supposed to represent how acclimation is presented. So it's a line with a check mark at the end, and then it has 6 to 8 weeks written above it. So this is what Finn and Mia were both told when they started their new journey with hearing aids. They were both at the hearing clinic, and they were told by the audiologist that it would take around 6 to 8 weeks to get used to the new sound. They'd have to wear their hearing aids about 8 hours a day from morning to evening. So that's kind of how it was presented to them. But then this drawing is supposed to a little bit more closely represent how it's actually experienced. This kind of experience of how long it takes to get used to the hearing aids. So it's a line, but at different intervals of the line, there are markings for people. So towards the beginning of the line, there's person A. For this person, it might take about the 6 to 8 weeks, the 2 months that the audiologist suggests that it's going to take to get used to having the new hearing aids. But for person B, who's a little bit more in the middle of the line, it might take about 3 to 4 months. So you might experience that it actually takes almost twice as long as you were told by your audiologist. This represents Finn and other people like him. He experiences that it takes about 3 or 4 months to get used to the hearing aids, and that's a pretty large chunk of time for him. Then towards the end of the line, there's person C, for which it might take about 6 months and even longer to get used to the hearing aids. This is something that Mia can see herself in. For her, it takes about half a year and sometimes even longer, sometimes because she has to go back and get adjustments for her hearing loss or for a hearing aid, but also just in general because it takes her a very long time to get used to the sound. And then finally, at the very end of the line, after the line is finished, there's person D who has a question mark above them. And that's because for some people, it can take such a long time that they feel like they never get used to it. It might take them a year or even longer. And it doesn't always matter whether they have followed the advice of the audiologist or not. They might have worn their hearing aids every day for 8 hours, but it can still take them a very long time to get used to the hearing aids. So this is also to sort of exemplify how the experience or this sort of period of time of transitional sound can be very different for each individual. For some people, it takes 2 weeks, and for some people, it takes up to a year to get used to it. And something that's pretty important to consider when understanding that for some people, it can take up to a year, and even just for some people, it might take 4 months or 6 months, is that something most people experience or express that they experience during this period of time is a sense of standing on uncertain ground. And here we have another little drawing, which has a line, but this time the line goes up and down. It's very wobbly. It has holes in between. It kind of stops and starts at different times. So there's this kind of sense of a very uncertain line, or a line that is very much not sort of connected. And this is supposed to represent the experience that a lot of people express having when they're going through this transitional period of time with sound. Is that they feel they're standing on uncertain ground, both because they feel like the sound around them is very confusing, they might not recognize it, everything feels a little bit off, but also because of the feelings that that invokes in them. So when we talk about uncertain ground, we kind of see it at different levels. So we see kind of the top level, or like the upper level, where it's about sounds all around you. So it might be that you hear a sound and you don't know if that's the sound of someone slamming a door or starting a car or yelling your name. And this is kind of that sense of, you know that you've recognized sounds before, you know that you will probably recognize sounds again, but right now the sounds you're getting feel so strange and different that it's really hard to recognize them, and it's really hard to respond to them. If you hear something and you think someone's slamming a door, but they're actually calling your name, then it's really difficult for you to respond to that and engage with that. So that's that kind of sense of having a really hard time feeling certain in the world around you, and having a really hard time navigating in the world around you. On kind of a second level of that, there's also social interactions and feeling uncertain within social interactions. And that's something that Mia had an experience with. She explains a time where she went to a restaurant and a bar with some of her friends from high school. They meet up every once in a while and they go to get a lot of good food and a lot of nice drinks. But this was a time where she had just started wearing new hearing aids. And even though she could kind of be a part of the evening, she felt that when people talked, when there was a lot of noise, it was very difficult to understand what was being said. So she experienced that there was a lot of sound with the new hearing aid. She got a lot more sound than she was used to, which was probably pretty good. But in the experience, it felt like none of the sound was distinguishable. So it wasn't kind of a sense of understanding what was happening, just being assaulted with a lot of sound. And though part of that evening she was able to participate and she felt that she could somewhat be a part of the group, at some point in the evening a song is played over the speakers, and all of a sudden all her friends start singing along. And even though Mia can kind of recognize that there's a song being played, she knows her friends are singing along, she thinks it's very likely that she knows this song, she doesn't recognize it. She can't distinguish the word or the melody, so everything feels very sort of fluffy and up in the air. So she can't really be a part of this. And that's a really difficult and aggressive experience to have, to be fully isolated from a group of friends that you've known forever, but you can't be a part of the social interaction they're having right now. So this is sort of the second level of uncertain ground, of this sort of sense of being disconnected from people around you. So not just from the general world navigating, but also from the people that are closest to you that you feel like you can no longer really connect to in this period of time because you're not hearing the same things. And then finally, there's a level that's a bit more intimate, which is about how you experience yourself and your own sense of self. And here I'm also going to bring an example from Finn, who sings a lot and plays music, and who explains that when he first gets new hearing aids, there's a long period of time where he feels like he can't recognize his own voice. So there's this sense of knowing what his voice is supposed to sound like or what it sounded like before, but now it feels like it's very different, or if not very different, then just different enough that he can't really recognize it, that something feels a little bit off. So that's sort of a very intimate experience of knowing your own voice and knowing that something feels wrong. And this might be difficult for most people, but it's especially difficult for Finn, who sings and plays music and feels like he's no longer really connected to that part of himself when he can't recognize his own voice. So for him, standing on uncertain ground is not just about his connection to the world around him or to the people around him, but also his connection to himself and his sense of being a person that has a place in the world. So it really disrupts his sense of self. Yeah, so this is what we mean when we say that people experience standing on uncertain ground, feeling like that the ways they've experienced things before are no longer really relevant. And one of the consequences, one of the impacts of that is also supposed to be kind of represented in this drawing. So again, there's a line, and at the beginning of the line, there's a marking that the individual that we're following has got new hearing aids. And around the line, there are a lot of people. In the beginning, it looks like the line kind of encapsulates people. But then when you get the new hearing aid, you kind of leave a lot of people out around this line. So there are people who are standing outside who have a lot of question marks. And this is also supposed to indicate that when you get new hearing aids, some people might end up isolating themselves. And not because they necessarily feel like they're being excluded or being isolated by others, but because they feel it's the only way they can really get through this period of time. Someone like Finn doesn't necessarily do it because he thinks it's very helpful or it feels very good for him to be around other people. But Mia, for example, isolates herself when she's getting new hearing aids because she needs a period of time where she doesn't feel like she has to be in social interactions where she doesn't really understand what's happening and she feels left out. Then she'd rather isolate herself, but she doesn't necessarily tell the people around her. So this is an important thing to recognize, that some people might isolate themselves, some might not, and some might not even explain why they're isolating themselves. But it can have a really great impact on their sense of being a social person and also being a part of something greater than themselves. And then finally, something I'd like to also point to is how your perspective on the situation also affects your experience. So one thing is that you might feel the first model kind of shows that you're standing on a line, but you're looking inward. So there are arrows pointed in towards yourself. So you might feel like that you're experiencing this period of time really aggressively. You can't look beyond it. Whereas the other drawing represents someone who's looking forward, who can still feel the impact of this difficult period of time, but also feels like they're able to look forward. And this isn't necessarily supposed to be a question about who's doing it right or what's the right way to do something, but it's to highlight that for some people, this period of time is just going to be more difficult and they might need more support. And then that's it from me about the insights we've gotten. And now I'll leave the word to Natalia, who will talk a little bit more about what we can kind of do or what we can learn from this.
Thank you, Natasha. It's very, very nice to hear about Finn and Mia, and very nice to get some words and pictures on how it is to be in a transitional sound period of life. In this last part of the presentation today, I will talk about what can we learn from this, because on the face of it, you could say that transitional sound it's a small moment in a long hearing life in this sense. But as I started out, in the interviews, it might be a short period of time. It might be a month, 2 months. It does not matter so much about the length, because it's not nice when you are in the transitional sound period. But eventually, for most people, you will get out and you will have a new normal. The new hearing aids will be the sound you are used to. But when we are talking about the experience of being in here, it's very important focal points in their hearing life, and it's very often that it's in the interviews we talk a lot about it, and it's not very often because when we try to talk about the experience to others, they're not heard. I'm sorry for the word, but if you tell their audiologist, but just say it's a period of time, you just have to wait it out, and you will eventually get new sound, and that's also right for most people. But it's not taken into account how it feels to be in it, and how profound it is to be in a period of time where you think, experience that the way you used to do things, the way you were experiencing yourself in the world, and how you did things, how you're hearing things, you could trust them. It's not as good. You cannot trust me this time. So it's a whole lot of experience for people with hearing loss, and it's not often acknowledged by others. But one thing we can learn from that is that very often the feelings and experiences of hearing loss are very private. We could talk about that hearing loss is privatized. It's the individual's own responsibility how they live with the hearing loss and how they experience it. It's also very clearly that this is not something you often speak with others about. And that's, you could say, that's the time that life and life in the modern society has been individualized, yes. But it also has the consequence that lots of the work, which we prefer to call hearing labor, has been privatized to the person living with the hearing impairment too. So it's feels it's these person who have to take this work and get through it and live to learn with it. And that's one thing we can learn, that this has been privatized. And we can also see, I think it's very interesting, that there is expectations connected with the new technology, but it's more or less understood, not spoken, but understood that new technology is better. And I'm not saying it's not, but as hearing aids and other aids are getting more advanced and takes a bigger role in life and takes more assignments or more power or decisions, it's getting harder and a larger piece of work to adjust to live with this part of your life, because you have a part work before, but it might was working on a bit different, and now you have to adjust to the new way. So it's clashes with the expectations that the new technology is better. It can be, but it demands a lot of labor from the person who is using the technology. And it can, and one consequence here is that if you as a person are not experiencing that the new technology is helping you as expected, then it's very often yourself you blame, which and you're not acknowledging that because it actually takes a lot of labor, hard work to get the use of this technology. It has to be integrated into your life. So that's, I think, is a very important point, but we have to acknowledge this. And finally, we would like to, we have touched it a bit before about transitional sound and hearing labor, but it's very important that for us that we see that that transitional sound is for us one case of how hearing labor can be seen. It's one case of one example of the work you have to do or we have to do when somebody has a hearing impairment, because adjusting to new hearing aids or pretending that you heard everything in a conversation, or making sure that you have to correct lighting in a room, or making sure that people understand that you have a hearing impairment, all kinds of small pieces of work is, in this perspective, hearing labor. And this is labor in a sense that it produces something, and it's something that could be sharing, and it's not necessarily the hard of hearing person who has to do the labor. It can be the surroundings, it can be in the physical environment, that if you have an environment which is good to hear in, or have good lighting, it helps hearing. It can also be the systems who are helping you to get the considerations for your hearing impairment and so on. But but the important thing we want to acknowledge is that we see this work. It's not necessarily very often seen or acknowledged, but it's more often seen that you have hearing aids. Well, when this problem is solved, you have the technical help, but this overshadows that you also have to do other kinds of labor with hearing loss. So that was some of the words, some of the perspectives in transitional sound, and we would like to finish up with some recommendations. I think I have already touched them a bit, but in connection with the transitional sound, if we just are able to talk about it, put some concepts on, this is work, this is hard work, and it is hard work because you feel that you are on uncertain grounds, that you have to learn something you could do before, you have to relearn, and so on. It takes energy, and it's not you as a person which is wrong or doing something wrong. It's just the situation you are in. You are changing something very profound in your life. And we have to acknowledge that this process can take quite a while, because you can have one hearing aid and you change it to another one because it might be better. You can have an adjustment and so on. But it can also be things around you that makes this transition harder, because it might be that you are stressed at work. It makes it harder. It can be that you have problems at home and so on. You have to take the whole picture. It's not just changing the technology, it's changing more than that. So one recommendation is just to be able to speak about that this is an issue, this is a challenge. And if we can that, we can help a lot of people, because we have seen, when we have talked about transitional sound, we can see people say, wow, I have tried that, I've been there, I've done that, I thought it was something wrong with me, but it is maybe not wrong with you, but maybe we are not good enough as professionals or hard of hearing persons to acknowledge the work we have to do when we are living with a person with a hearing impairment. And now we'll give the last word to Natasha.
Thank you so much, Henrik. And I'll just finalize this presentation by opening up some points of discussion. First off, do you recognize these experiences, or do you recognize them in others, or even to an extent? As well as why is the extent of the difficulties of this period of time not widely recognized and acknowledged? And finally, how can we work to acknowledge and help people with hearing loss through this period of time? And then at the end of this slide, there are our contact information. And then I think we'd just like to say thank you so much for letting us talk about this. And we're really excited to hear all your thoughts and comments and questions and feedback. Thank you so much.